This is an overview of the term project requirements for the course. Just as a reminder, the term project addresses a hazard, a single hazard, and a single town. And you're going to discuss how that hazard impacts that town and how that town is responding to the hazard. There are a lot of details provided and a sample outline in ReggieNet and on the website. This is just going to go over the sections of the report and discuss some of the things that you might want to include in those sections. So we begin with the introduction. That's the first section in your report. What you're going to want to do is describe the hazard and the town that you're discussing, so that you're just kind of introducing this is what the report is about. You should describe the community, how many people live there, where it's located, little details on the history of the town, that kind of thing. And then, so that'd be like a paragraph. You probably have some pictures or a map. And then you'll also have a few paragraphs on the hazard itself. What is the hazard? How does it work? Just some real basics about that hazard and maybe why it impacts this particular area. And then we get into the body of the report. The first section in the body of the report is simply the history of the hazard and this town. So we don't want all the tornadoes in Illinois. If we're doing tornadoes in Bloomington, we want the tornadoes that have occurred in and around Bloomington. So the best approach is to list some historical occurrences, as many as you can. Some people use a table, some people just kind of list them out, and then describe several of the more notable events. So, you might find a lot of information, for example, on the flood of 1952 or something, and then you can put that information in there. So, and you'll want several of those notable events and what happened, what caused them, and what kind of impact they might have had on the town. You can also include events that were close. So if you're doing tornadoes, for example, you won't have a lot of tornadoes that impact a specific town, but you'll find that there were tornadoes nearby, let's say within 10 or 15 miles, that have had an impact maybe on neighboring towns, so that you can include in the history if it's something like that. So, and again, use pictures, maps, charts. Find whatever information you can, show where these historical events were, and discuss what their impact was. That leads into the next section in the body of the report, which is how likely is this hazard to impact the community. Typically the approach is to choose several different magnitudes. Let's say it's hurricanes in Miami. What's the likelihood that a Category 5 hurricane will hit Miami? It's low, very low. What about a Category 1? That's going to be much higher. It's a smaller type of a hurricane. More of them occur in a season. So typically you include kind of a worst case scenario, but several magnitudes and the probability of each of those. And again, you can use maps and charts, and very often you would want to refer back to the history. So if you've got a history that has, say, 20 tornadoes over the course of 40 years, then every year there's like a 1 in 2 chance that you'll have a tornado. And then you can look at how big those tornadoes were. So maybe most of them are really small, and the probability of a really big one is only 1 over those 40 years. So you can bring the history in to help inform the probability. In addition, you'll find that government websites very often have probability forecasts for some of these hazards. So there's good probability forecasts for hurricanes if you're on the coast, for tsunamis, for earthquakes. So if you can find that kind of published information, you would definitely want to include that as well. The next section is the consequences. What would happen if the hazard hit your community? You've already discussed the history, so you can use some examples from past events to say, when the big earthquake hit back in 1906, this happened. And so today, we've improved preparation, but here's what we think would happen with a similar size earthquake. Um, if a flood occurs, here's the areas that would be damaged, and here's how much damage we think would occur. And again, a lot of government websites do forecasting on this where they project what would happen for hazards of different sizes. And this is also where you would include any linkages to other hazards. So if an earthquake would cause a potential landslide in the area, you would want to discuss it here in the consequences section. You can illustrate this with maps and photos, and you can also refer to similar events that have occurred in similar towns. You could say, this town that I'm talking about hasn't had a tsunami recently, but here's what happened when a tsunami occurred in Japan. Here's the damage that was done. So you can use that as an analogy. That's a good way to describe consequences. The next section is really important to do some good local research, and that is describe how the hazard is currently addressed. What plans are in place in this town? The best place to get this information is to call some local emergency responders. Now, don't call 911. They always have non-emergency numbers, and that's what you would call. Fire department is usually called upon to respond to most hazardous events, and they typically have plans. The other thing you could look at is the city planning agency, whatever that might be. Sometimes it's the zoning board. Sometimes they're called the city planning agency. And they will very often have plans that look ahead, that try to keep development out of risky areas, or that require certain structural responses to the hazard. So in an earthquake zone, they might require buildings to be built in a certain way. If it's a flood zone, it might require buildings to be built up above the flood level. So to get this information, you're going to have to go local. If it's a big city, sometimes they'll have the information posted online. If it's a small town, you can usually call City Hall or the fire department and find somebody who can walk you through what they do. So this section is a really important part of the report. And if you were to ever move into a town, it would be really important for you to know how the hazard is addressed. And then the next section is, how do you think the hazard should be addressed? So you get to critique that plan. What do you think they're doing right? And what do you think they could do to improve? And you would want to reflect on things we've learned and discussed in class, things that are referenced in the textbook, and say, they're really missing this one piece I think they should do. And so in order for this section to be good and accurate, this section has to be good and accurate. You have to know what the plans are before you can critique them. Sometimes I get these reports where somebody says the town really needs to have tornado sirens, and they already do. Or the town really needs to have building codes, and they already do. And I do look into these and check to see. So it's important for you to do that as well. So that's the main body of the report. History of the hazard, likelihood it will occur, consequences, how it's being addressed, and how you think it should be addressed. And then you can wrap up the report with a summary paragraph or two describing the most important and the most interesting findings. I have a typo on my slide there. And the impact the report has had on you. That's just a nice little wrap it up and tie it with a bow at the end. Some other things that I look for when I grade is I look for the depth of information that you've presented. Is this an overview that looks like somebody wrote it up in an hour, or did you actually dig into the history? Did you actually find some maps of the area? What kind of research did you do? So depth of information is very important. You need to reference all of your facts. You have to use proper citation. Now, I don't mind if you use MLA or APA or Chicago style. Any of those work for me, but you really need to cite your sources in the text. Show me the work that you did. Show me where you went to get that information and call it out in the text. And then at the end, there needs to be a references cited page so I can see a summary of the places where you went to get information. And that is part of my assessment. So if you do this report and you didn't get any local information, that's a concern to me, and that's going to hurt your grade. So make sure you reference things, cite them in the text, and include them on a references cited page. And use proper formatting. It's good practice to do it. I'm going to be looking at the visual elements. Don't give me something that's all text. Part of the grade will be, do you have maps? Do you have photos, charts, graphs? Things that make the report easier to understand. It's very difficult to describe the path a tornado took. It's much easier to have a map that shows the path that it took, some photos that illustrate the damage that was done. And that's true for any of these hazards. If you're doing the flood hazard, you should have a flood hazard map from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. We have a link within our course materials to find that. So there are certain expectations of visual elements. And then the last thing you should do when your report is all done and looks great, pull out the key information, turn it into a presentation. You can use PowerPoint, you can use Prezi, which is online, but I want to see a presentation that summarizes your report. Don't give me a presentation on tornadoes. We're already doing that in class. I would like a presentation on tornadoes impacting Bloomington, a map that shows maybe where tornadoes have been for the history section. Think of the sections that you have in the report and have slides for each of those sections so that we have a nice overview, some text, so don't just give me all pictures, but a mixture of important pieces of information illustrated by pictures and maps, etc. And that's really the whole report. The idea here is that you can pull together some information to investigate and illustrate how a hazard impacts a town. And this is something that I would hope that you could use in the future when you're planning to buy a house, move to a new city, so that you can understand what kind of natural hazards are in that area. And by doing this project, you'll understand how to look into that information, how to find what the risks are, and to see how they're addressed. So that's the overview of the term project. And if you have any questions, you can ask them in the group discussion, or you can send me an email if there's something in particular that you're concerned about.